Welcome to this afternoon's session on working with clients in difficult situations. I want to first acknowledge that I am living and working on the lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, Coast Salish peoples. Others of you, if you want to put your acknowledgements in the chat, that's always nice to see. So I want to thank Christy for agreeing to do this presentation. Christy Uris is a program manager at the Ending Violence Association. She's in charge of a lot of the training and legal and policy analysis there. Christy also was a longtime advocate and manager at the Kettle. So she has a long tradition of working in advocacy and working skillfully with people who do face a variety of challenges. So I'm really happy to have her doing this session. As with other sessions, we've talked about having you put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll follow them along and catch Chrissy's attention if a question arises. And then the other thing that I want to make clear before we go too far is that it's a 2-hour session, not a 3-hour session. So you've got an extra hour. I mean, depends where you signed up and what you saw, but it was listed on Shed as a 3-hour session, but that should have been a 2-hour session. So I think that's all of that I need to get out of the way. And I'll pass it over to you, Christy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lois. Just a quick question that I forgot to ask before everyone joined us. Are we taking a break?
Oh, we can, certainly.
Okay, so maybe around 2 o'clock, we can take a quick 10-minute break and folks can stretch and get water or do whatever to get their eyes off Zoom for a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for that introduction. And I'll just in addition to questions that you might have, whether you want to raise your hand, or it's probably easiest to put them in the chat. I also want to invite people, depending on what it is that we're talking about, to add your contributions as well. If we're talking about a specific subject and you have strategies or ideas that you want to share with other folks in the Zoom room, please do that, because I know there's a lot of useful collective knowledge in the room that we can all benefit from. So before we get into the material, as Lois said, I did spend many years working at the Kettle Society as the manager of the advocacy service there. And first of all, sorry, I wanted to first say that I am zooming in from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Latakodeni people. And I would certainly invite folks to take a moment to introduce themselves and let us know what territory you're zooming in from. That would be wonderful. The community I live in is also known as Quesnel, so I'm up north where it's getting cold. Before we get started and move into the substance of the material, I wanted to preface my comments with a few qualifiers, I guess. So first of all, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not an expert in conflict resolution. What I do have is about 20 plus years of experience working with folks with mental health issues, working with survivors of gender-based violence, working with people with multiple trauma and oppression. And most of what I've learned over that period of time, I've learned from those folks who've been very generous with me, and also have had the benefit of working with some really great colleagues, peers, and mentors. Secondly, I want to reassure people that you likely are more skilled and effective than you realize in working in these types of challenging situations. I think, when I was fairly new in this work, I was looking for, I guess, maybe a magic bullet or a set of principles or rules to be able to respond effectively to these types of situations. And what I learned is that, there are some key principles and strategies that we will talk about today, and I hope you'll feel empowered to share any that you have. we all have different ways of working. We're all unique. We all have different approaches and personalities. And what has worked well for me in my practice or in my way of working with folks might not resonate for you in the same way, but hopefully you'll get some useful tips out of it. And what I've also learned is that there's no one specific approach that's always going to work with every client. Even with clients who present similarly, who have similar types of situations, one of the things that I found to be really helpful in this work is being adaptive and responsive to individual situations, using the skills that I've developed, my intuition, to best meet people where they're at. So all of the skills that you have brought to your work, whether that's doing advocacy work, doing other kinds of service work, whether that's working as a waiter or working at a call center, working as an advocate, all of those skills that you bring are going to help you and empower you to do this work well. So just to give you that little preface before we get started. Okay, thanks everybody for introducing yourself. It's nice to see folks from different parts of the province. Welcome. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so before we get into talking about some specifics about some of the challenging situations that Lois shared with me in terms of what folks are concerned about or areas that they find it difficult to respond to and wanted more ideas around, I wanted to talk a little bit about context. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because I think folks who are here today understand the context very well and understand the multiple challenges that people are facing. But I did want to, just make a quick reference to it and recognize that people are coming to us dealing with multiple and very complex situations, and just to acknowledge how challenging it is for the folks that we're working with. Talk a little bit more about some best practices in communication. And I'm going to be somewhat repeating myself over the course of the presentation and emphasizing a lot of practices that I've certainly found useful in my work. And then talking about some specific challenging situations that you might encounter. And again, want to invite people to contribute any thoughts and strategies that you have found useful in your work. Before I continue, I'll just it's a Zoom world, so I'll just let folks know that I do have 2 dogs who are sharing this space with me, and sometimes they can be quite loud and barky. I'm really hoping they'll stay quiet, but I do apologize in advance if they do bark, and I'll do my best to put myself on mute for a few seconds while that happens. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about the context in which folks present themselves or come to us for help. I mean, we know that people are dealing with multiple and complex challenges. There are issues that people are facing, everything from, the legal issues that they're presenting with, poverty, poor housing, lack of social supports, lack of medical and psychiatric supports, multiple experiences of stigma and discrimination. And sometimes we're not always going to be aware, especially when it comes to issues of mental health and trauma, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. We're not always going to be aware of all of those complex challenges and personal challenges that people are facing. For example, one of the things that I experienced a lot in my work, even though the organization I worked for specifically worked with folks with mental health and substance misuse issues, people were generally quite mistrustful of even people providing service. There wasn't always that willingness or ability to distinguish between us as advocates and other professionals or other folks that they perceived as being in a position of authority. So people were sometimes reluctant to disclose what exactly was going on for them in terms of their mental health and their substance misuse because of stigma, because of discrimination. So there was a lot of times where I didn't know the full extent of what someone was dealing with. So it was very difficult for me to at times work with people and be able to understand their personal situation and their context and be able to respond effectively to it. So I think it's important that we remember that it's not necessarily personal to us. It's about how people experience the world, how people experience different systems, and that there may be a lack of willingness to share all of those specific challenges. But we know that they're multiple and that they're complex, and that in addition to dealing with issues of things like stigma and discrimination, which was such a powerful presence in the lives of folks that I worked with, and I'm sure with a lot of people you work with as well. People are engaged with multiple systems that are often fragmented and inadequate, as we know. You know this reality as well as I do, and as well as the clients we work with do, that people are often coming to us with extremely high levels of frustration. They're very hopeless. They're ready to give up. They are often engaged, as I said, with multiple systems, and that burden of coordinating those disparate and often inadequate systems fall on their shoulders. So there's a lot of, by the time that somebody's coming to our door, they're often very frustrated, and they're often very tired of having to navigate those systems that often are not responsive. And we know that there's a lack of adequate care and resources in any number of systems that people are engaged with. So, that's often what, when I was working with people at the Kettle, there was often, a lot of frustration and anger and people feeling like they were being moved from service to service and didn't know where to get help, or were given poor referrals. And, that was something that I often had to deal with. And I think that's probably something that, you folks experience a lot as well. The other thing that I think it's important to talk about when we're talking about challenging situations is that, we're often dealing with clients who are experiencing trauma, and that trauma can be based on what we call acute trauma, which is a single traumatic event, which is limited in time. It could be someone that has experienced chronic trauma, or complex trauma. So there's a series of severe and long-term trauma. And we know that people who've experienced trauma for any number of reasons are often engaged with legal systems, and that the traumas that they face might be multiple and very complex in nature. So things like colonization and genocide, racism, gender-based violence, poverty, discrimination. And what we also know about trauma is that an individual's response to trauma is often compounded by previous traumas that they've experienced, and also the kinds of supports and services that they received when they experience trauma, which we know are often lacking. So that's that whole issue of trauma, which I think we're having very, very good conversations about. And I'm imagining there's been other training available specifically on this issue at this conference, is really helping us to understand how folks may present some of the behaviors that we see, and also giving us trauma-informed practice and strategies to be able to avoid re-traumatizing people in our practices and in the way that we work with them, and hopefully giving them an opportunity to have some choice and some agency and hopefully some healing in the ways in which we work with them. So what do we see when people are living with trauma? And obviously, as we know, people respond very, very differently to trauma, and some of the ways that it manifests itself are going to look very different for different people. And how one person may respond to a particular traumatic event or series of traumatic events is going to be very different from someone else. And that's part of, I think, being what we call trauma informed, is understanding that, people are very individual in terms of their response, and, what may affect one person quite minimally may affect someone else very dramatically. So when we're working with people who have trauma, some of the the behaviors or some of the manifestations might look like just a real difficulty trusting others. I know that some of the work that I do now and have done in the past is working with survivors of sexualized violence. And one of the things that I've seen a lot, as one might expect, is just a real loss or what you might call a profound violation of one's sense of self and security in the world. So there, as a result of that, there's a great difficulty trusting other people, and especially people who there's a perceived there might be a perceived authority figure there. People who have experienced trauma may experience flashbacks, which are, random reliving of events that occurred, which, is scary enough, obviously, unto itself, but gives that individual a feeling like they've lost control, they've lost, their ability to discern what's real and what isn't real, and just that the world is a scary place and their own brains are unsafe. There might be avoidance or numbing behavior. So sometimes we see, obviously, substance abuse would be one example of that, but perhaps avoidance of places or people or things that remind them of the trauma that occurred. And again, we're not always going to be able to identify what that looks like or what those people, place, and things might be. But again, it's having an awareness of that might be happening. There might also be what we call hyperarousal. So lots of irritability, inability to sleep, anger, just being on guard, being wary all the time, being very sensitive and aware of surroundings, poor emotional regulation. So an inability to control emotions and impulses, sometimes some cognitive distortions associated with that, and then memory and concentration impairments. So trauma often interferes because of what's happening in the brain and in the body with the ability to actually remember things that happened, and also, because there's distractions going on, there's often an ability to concentrate. So all of this is important in the sense of being able to assist us to understand what might be happening for people when they're in those kinds of challenging situations, and how trauma and previous trauma can make it challenging to stay in the moment, to focus on what needs to be done moving forward with a particular issue or a particular case. And it can help us to be able to, when we understand these challenges, being able to work with somebody to try and meet them where they're at, to look at what might be going on in an individual situation, and help them work through it and develop specific strategies to be able to help them be present in the moment and do the work that we need to do. Because obviously we're not counselors. We're not going to be able to, help people in the long term dealing with their trauma, but we can certainly put some strategies in place to be able to support them if these things are happening to them while we're working together. So what does it mean to be so sorry, before I go on, also one of the things that I often experienced when I was working primarily with folks with mental health issues, but there were a lot of barriers that were in place in terms of being able to get to what the nature of the issue was that they were coming to see me about, and being able to actually work through it. So a lot of mental health disorders or illnesses will cause a number of different challenges in terms of being able to work with folks. So it may be that people really are not even able to identify or articulate what kind of help they need. Could be because they're dealing with multiple crises, or they're easily distracted, or they're just so emotionally dysregulated that they can't identify what's going on for them. If someone has what we call thought disorders, they might really speak very incoherently or tangentially. They might, shift from one topic to another at will, or want to talk about several issues within a short period of time, which can be very challenging. They might be able to not be able to focus, or again, lack concentration. They might be very, very panicked or anxious in an appointment setting, or in a setting where there's lots of people, or when they're outside of a space that feels safe for them. They might lack motivation to follow up, even though their situation might be urgent. That's seen often with folks who are depressed, and sometimes with the flat aspects of folks who have schizophrenia, and they might have poor executive and planning skills. So their ability to follow up and make decisions may be very compromised. So what are some general principles in terms of being able to support people who are in these kinds of situations? So again, one thing is having trauma and mental health awareness. And I think, as I was saying, there is a lot of education and work that's being done to increase our understanding of what trauma looks like. None of us have to be therapists or psychologists or understand necessarily everything that's going on physiologically in the brain and the body, but we can have an understanding that these are factors and how it might manifest differently for different people, and be able to explain some of that to the folks that we're working with, that some of what they're experiencing might be connected to either their mental health or trauma that they've experienced. One of the things that I found to be really, really helpful in my work, and is probably something that I would stress more than anything, regardless of the nature of the challenging situation that you're dealing with, is really taking time to work with folks to develop a relationship with them. As I was saying, people are often distrustful, people are often engaged with multiple systems. If you have people who've had a long history of being involved in the psychiatric system, for example, there's obviously sometimes that's not always a voluntary choice, and people don't always have agency to make decisions around their own healthcare, so might be very distrustful of different systems. People might have other very, very good reasons for being distrustful of systems. So taking that time to establish that rapport and to build a relationship with someone is really, really important, and understanding that the development of that relationship is probably going to take more time from the very beginning of working with someone all the way to the resolution of a case than it might in other circumstances. And one of the things that I think most folks will have heard, and maybe Myrna has presented at the conference as well, but people will probably have heard of Myrna McCallum, who does a great podcast called The Trauma-Informed Lawyer. And one of the things that she talks about is the importance of developing safety and trust in a relationship being as important as the actual outcomes of a case. And I think that's a very important principle, that when we're working with people who are traumatized or people who are dealing with multiple challenges, really emphasizing having a good relationship with that person, and taking that time to develop that trust is just as important as whatever the outcomes are. And I think there's a shift definitely in terms of how we build relationships with clients to recognize how critical that is, in addition to being professional and providing good advice and doing all the follow-up pieces that we need to do. One of the things that I've also found it really useful is to be really clear with folks about things like the time involved in resolving an issue or working on an issue, the specific things I can do and I can't do, so whatever service restrictions might exist, and what an agenda might be for working together. So it's partly about giving those opportunities for choice, for collaboration, and to connect with people. So being really clear up front about what the options are, what the possible outcomes are, and giving people an opportunity to contribute to that process. So mutually creating agreements about what your time together is going to look like. Because again, if you've experienced a traumatic event, your choice and your agency has been taken away from you. So if we can create agreements about how long we're going to work together at a specific appointment, what we're going to cover, it helps people feel like they have some choice and they're a part of the process. What is going to be agreed upon in terms of outcomes. This is what we're going to focus on today. This is how much time we have, and it is also helpful in terms of boundaries because we only have so much time. I know that some folks are dealing with high caseloads, lots of demands on your time, lots of things to follow up on. So being really clear about what time you have available and what hopefully you're going to try and accomplish in that time. And getting, contributions back from the person you're working with about whether that's also their agenda. So that can be something that's really helpful. And as I was saying, because concentration and memory and just understanding can be compromised, I found it really helpful to be really short, clear, and direct in my when I'm giving information and when I'm asking questions. It's not necessarily the thing I'm best at. I tend to be a bit long-winded and overly wordy when I speak. So one of the things I really had to work on in practice was really thinking about not how I was processing information, but really thinking about the person in front of me and how they were hearing and processing the information I was trying to give. So trying to just cover one topic, one direction at a time, be really, brief and clear when I was asking questions, when I was giving information, and also being able to clarify understanding to make sure that what I was actually trying to say was being heard, because sometimes, I found that I thought I was being clear and direct, and it turned out that that was not the case. And I really needed to make sure that I was engaging with that other person to clarify and to ensure that they were understanding what I was saying. Another thing that I think is really important in this work is, we can't be all things to all people. And I know, again, we're working in systems that are really inadequate, and especially when we work in rural communities. That's been I worked in Vancouver for 25 years. And then about 7 years ago, I moved up here to Quesnel. And obviously the resources, not that there's enough resources in urban centers, but certainly in rural, and I work with a lot of rural and remote communities in the area of gender-based violence. And one of the things that people are always struggling against is a lack of resources. Oftentimes, an advocate or a victim service worker is kind of like the one person in town who is providing multiple services to the best of their ability to the folks that they're working with. So I know that this is a really big struggle, but it's also important, I think, for us to recognize where our limits are, what our job is, what our role is, and to work with the people that we're working with to identify other supports that they might have. So that could be, it could be a counselor, it could be a crisis service, it could be again, a victim service worker. So being able to, could be a friend, it could be a family member, helping that person to identify supports and people that can help them in other aspects of their life. And also looking at strengths. I mean, I think one of the things that it's often very easy to do when we're working with people with trauma is to, really focus on the terrible things that have happened to them. And I think there's a time and a place for that. And I certainly think people need space and, empowerment to be able to talk about what they've experienced. And at the same time, I think it can also be really important to identify places where people have survived and their strength and resilience in getting themselves to the place that they are now. I know that's something that, again, working with survivors of sexualized violence, reframing how they survived a sexual assault, whether that was like freezing up and emphasizing that that is something that is a strength, that's resilience, being able to survive, that can be really helpful in terms of helping people see themselves as more than just their trauma, and giving them appreciation for their strengths. Oops. Okay. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. I feel like I'm moving along, and wondering if folks have any questions so far. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to scroll up here. Okay.
There's one about, can you talk about how you help clients choose and manage the disclosure of personal information and traumatic events, including when you don't need to know it?
Oh God, that's a tough one too. All these questions are tough. And again, they're, I think very individualized. So I think depending on what the nature of the issue is, it's really important to identify what the nature of the issue is that you're going to be helping someone with. I always found that it was helpful to give a small amount of time for people to have a more general conversation about what was going on for someone. So, especially when I was meeting someone for the first time, to give them 10 or 15 minutes of unstructured processing or venting or just conversation time. And then to really kind of hone in on what it was that they were specifically asking me about, or what they were coming to me for assistance for. And I think that there are going to be things that you don't really need to know in terms of their experience of traumatic events that are not necessarily relevant to the particular issue that they're facing. I mean, it can help you kind of understand the context of the situation, but doesn't necessarily help you get to any kind of resolution of the issue. So I think, sometimes just drawing people back to, sometimes I would say, I would empathize, obviously, if someone started sharing something that was deeply personal or deeply traumatic. But if I found that I didn't think it was relevant to the particular situation, which it often isn't, because, oftentimes it's historical. Say, for example, if you're dealing with a welfare issue or a housing issue, it might not necessarily be relevant to that particular circumstance. So, obviously being empathetic and saying something heartfelt about how difficult it must have been for somebody to go through a situation like that. And that you can suggest resources and supports that might be available to them, so that they can talk to somebody whose role and whose expertise is in helping people move through traumatic events, but that right now we're here to focus on your legal issue and drawing them back to the information that you need to be able to really focus on the issue at hand. So it's a hard one. I think empathy is really important, but also not over broadening the role that you have to play, because I think, sometimes people, again, really lack support to be able to talk about some of this stuff. So if you can, find ways to redirect them to someone who might be more appropriate to have those conversations with, then I think that's really helpful.
Another question was a person she says, I have a client who basically relies on me for her only support. This can be very draining, and I'm trying to connect her with other resources and supports, but she often doesn't feel heard. That's sort of the first part of the question. And then the other part is any suggestions on how to help her build those relationships, especially with groups that may not be as trauma informed.
Right. Okay. So I'm just wondering, have you set, one of the things that I've certainly experienced that in my work as well. And I think we all have very, as I was saying earlier, I think we all have very different approaches and personalities. And I know that got myself in trouble sometimes, not in trouble, but in trouble internally by kind of taking on too much and probably being more available and taking on a broader role than it was actually appropriate for me to take on in terms of, being that sort of primary support for someone. And I think that's, when we know that people are disconnected and alienated and alone, it's very easy to want to fulfill that role. So one of the things that I had to do was I really had to set some clear boundaries around how much support that I was able and willing to give people and be really clear with them about it. So I would have, I can certainly recall a few, more than a few clients that I worked with, in particular clients who were quite high conflict, where, they would, want to call me every couple of days and, have long conversations about, what they were going through and their emotional state and other types of issues. And I really had to set some boundaries and say like that I have this amount of time on this particular day so that they knew that I wasn't abandoning them, that I wasn't disconnecting from them. But they also knew that my time was limited and that I had to, attend to other work. I had other clients that I had to work with. So sometimes having specific time frames and time limitations set out and really following through on that can be really helpful just in terms of being clear about expectations and role, and also for your own well-being. This work can be very difficult and we can experience a lot of stress and vicarious trauma. So having your own boundaries, I think, is really important. I'm wondering, is it possible in terms of helping that person access other supports, the second part of the question, two things that come to mind. One is, I wonder if you're less available or your time is more limited and circumscribed, would that be helpful in terms of encouraging that person to solicit other more appropriate supports? And so that's something to think about. And also, is it possible to do some facilitation or accompaniment or I'm not sure what the other word might be, like just reaching out to some of those other service providers? Is there somebody in your organization who can kind of help with transition that relationship, whether that's like attending an appointment with that person or being present for that initial phone call, or with that client's permission, providing some background information about what works well in terms of working with that person? Because some of the strategies that you might have developed that have helped you have a good relationship might be helpful for them to know.
So there's another question. Oh, someone said that they could hear a cat meowing. No, that is not Christy's cat. That's my cat.
There's cats everywhere.
No manners and apparently never gets fed. Someone said, I'm interested in learning how to react appropriately and supportively when clients laugh when talking about their trauma, in terms of body language and verbal responses.
That's interesting. I haven't actually experienced that. I mean, I think, and would welcome other folks who may have some tips on that, because that's I don't know that I've seen that happen, but if someone else is laughing, or even if it's not necessarily like genuine laughter, my kind of automatic response, I think, is to laugh along with them. I think I see that somebody raised their hands, but I think maintaining neutrality, as much neutrality as possible, regardless of what the trauma response is, whether that's crying or, anger or, whatever it might be, trying to just be open to whatever it is that somebody needs to experience in that moment and not commenting or judging it, I think is really important, because again, we know that people respond very, very differently when they're talking about their traumas, when they're, even experiencing or reliving traumas. I think, some people are very cold. Some people are very clinical about how they talk about their trauma. Other people are, very emotional. So I think as much as we can just be open to it and non-reactive to it, I think is really helpful, because it just gives people that space to be able to be present in the moment that they're in, and be able to express whatever it is that they may need to express. And one of the things that I've found, and I'm not saying anything new or revelatory here, is just really paying attention to what's going on in my body, because it's very easy to be triggered in our own way by the stories that we hear and the situations that people experience. I think that's, our empathy and our compassion. So one of the things that I really try and focus on is just really remaining calm in my own body, doing my deep breathing, controlling my own thoughts, not letting myself spiral down into the story too much. So I think just as much as you can just be, pay attention to what's going on in your own body and breathe through it and stay calm and non-reactive. I think that's probably the most helpful tip that I have.
Thanks. Frances, is your hand still up?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to add in, generally when I have clients that are laughing about or laughing when they're sharing their experiences with me, it's because they're uncomfortable. And so I just kind of go into talking to them about, if this is too uncomfortable, we don't have to address everything, or just talking to them about the experience and let them see that I'm comfortable talking about this so that they don't have to feel uncomfortable sharing that with me.
Yes, that is such a good point, that we often laugh when we're uncomfortable. And so, again, I love that reminder to make people, or to help people understand that it's a safe space, and that there's no, that we're not uncomfortable, that we're not, we're going to hear what it is that people have to say to the best of our ability. And that it's a safe space to talk. So I think that's a good point. Thanks for that. Okay, great questions. I really love all of the thoughtful questions and responses, and please feel free to continue to put questions in the chat. So just a couple more things. I see we're almost getting to break time. It's gone really fast. And then after our break, we'll spend some time just talking about some challenging situations. So obviously, one of the things that's really important is there are going to be times when we can't help someone, or the resolution that we are able to come up with, or the options that we're able to come up with, are not going to be satisfactory. And, sometimes that can make people angry. It can make them feel very disempowered. It can make them feel like we're not on their side, even if, we are, and our true intention is to be helpful. I think just demonstrating that we empathize and we understand how frustrating and difficult it might be to be in their particular situation. And acknowledging that frustration, and again, conveying that message that we've heard their concerns, we know it's frustrating. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, we might not be able to help, but that we're there to support them. I think I'm just going to move on to the next slide here. Some other tips that I've learned over my time. So practicing self-care and being non-attached to outcomes. And I don't mean this kind of like a religious or spiritual way, but one of the things that I really had to work on in my history as an advocate was not being so attached to how people showed up, when they showed up, being attached necessarily to the outcome of a case, Because what I sometimes found, and I think there are probably lots of people who can relate, was that, I would spend a lot of time, for example, working on an appeal, or a residential tenancy hearing, or, working with somebody to deal with their debt. And they, I'd put hours in, I'd do the research, I'd write the submission, and then people would disappear, or people would change their minds in the middle of it. And, initially I got quite frustrated and felt like it was a waste of time, or that, I had other priorities. And it was really helpful for me to be able to detach myself from what decisions other people made around their case. It's their life, it's their decision. And sometimes that's going to happen, whether it's somebody withdraws from a case, or a lot of people would just disappear because of the multiple crises that were going on in their lives and not follow up. And sometimes I would just lose, right? Because I didn't have a good argument, or the facts of the case were not supportive of the argument that I was trying to make. So it was really helpful for me to be able to detach myself. Not that I didn't care, or that I didn't want positive outcomes for people. Obviously, we all do this work for that reason, but also being able to say, okay, it's okay if it doesn't work out the way that I think it should, or that I want to, or I put in work into a case that ultimately doesn't come to fruition, or that I lose, or that somebody abandons. Practicing lots of self-care. I think, I don't know what everybody's individual working circumstances are, but as much as we can, like using our team and our colleagues and our peers for support, making sure we're, resting, that we're scheduling our appointments. If we have a particularly difficult client that we're working with, or we know that we're going to hear a particularly difficult story one day, scheduling that appointment so that, there's some time afterwards for decompression, to take a walk, to have a cup of tea, to do whatever it is that you do to nourish yourself. And I know that there's a lot of pressure, and there's, a lot of, time and resource limitations, but as much as we can take care of ourselves and recognize that, we can only care for others if we care well for ourselves, is really important. Being, again, as I said earlier, recognizing and identifying opportunities for people to emphasize their own strengths. I think this is really important, especially with people who are depressed, who are really struggling with motivation, or a loss of pleasure in life, or a loss of their sense of self, or dealing with trauma, like places where that you can identify and appreciate their strengths and give them specific tasks to take on. Might not be something really substantive. It might not even be something that's significant, but really giving people that opportunity to be a part of what's going on, and giving them lots of encouragement for taking those steps and being invested in resolving whatever their issue is. Again, prioritizing your self-care, having realistic goals for yourself, and recognizing the limits of your role and where a referral was appropriate. And again, as I was saying earlier, one of the things I really struggled to do when I was doing this work originally, and I started out working with people as an advocate, working with people with HIV and AIDS, and working with people in prisons. And, the needs that folks had were just really overwhelming. They were just dealing with so many multiple issues. And I think I took on too much and really had a very broad view of my role, and realized that, one, I didn't have the time or the capacity to do all of the things I wanted to do, nor did I have the skill to be able to do them. So being able to recognize, like, my role is as an advocate, and of course I can be a trauma-informed advocate, I can be empathetic, I can be a support person for someone, but there are other folks who may have a different role and may be more appropriate to take on this piece of work. So so those are some general tips. And I see Jen has added that non-attachment helps me be pleasantly surprised when clients find creative solutions or deciding bodies offer help. Absolutely. Okay, so I see we're at 2. So let's take a 10-minute break and come back.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. Are we ready to come back, Lois?
Yep, I think people are probably there. More people came back.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone had a chance to stretch and get some water and take a little Zoom break. So let's talk a little bit about some challenging situations that are likely to come up or have come up probably repeatedly in the work that you do. And again, want to invite folks who are comfortable to add any strategies or tools that they have in their toolkit to address some of these situations. This is certainly not the final word on responding well. You know, there's some tips and skills that I've developed, but, you know, please feel free to add any that you find work well for you. So one of the things that Lois had raised with me that folks wanted to address was dealing with angry clients or hostile clients. And obviously this is something that comes up quite frequently, or I certainly experienced quite frequently in the work that I did. And, you know, I think this is one situation where, again, being sort of intuitive and responsive to how people connect with you and how people respond to different kinds of interventions is going to be really important. So some people respond when they're angry, they respond really well to empathy, right? Like, I hear you. I can see that you're really angry. I appreciate this is really difficult for you. Other people can get even more angry when you kind of respond in that way. So I think, although I think empathy is always a good strategy, you're obviously going to want to gauge how people are responding to your approach. And you're also going to have to do what you feel comfortable with doing. Obviously, your own physical and emotional safety are always a priority. So the first thing that I always talk about is, you know, having existing protocols, safety protocols in your workplace. And that's, you know, probably going to look a little bit different depending on where you work and the number of staff and the resources that you have. But that's obviously, you know, making sure that you're following, you know, whether it's having an exit or, you know, making sure you're positioned, you know, close to the door so you can leave. Should the situation escalate, you know, do you have a panic button if you're in need of support or help in a particular situation? Do you need to have more than one staff present? Do you need to interview or work with somebody and have somebody else there just to maintain physical safety? Or do you need to have a check-in where somebody checks, you know, in to see how things are going after a particular period of time? Some of those things can be really helpful just in terms of making one feel safe and confident in a particular situation when a client's angry. One of the things that I've found is helpful is, you know, asking myself, you know, is this person's anger reasonable in the circumstances? And quite often it is. You know, again, folks are dealing with complex situations, are often being treated poorly, or often being discriminated against. So their anger is quite reasonable in the circumstances. And is it possible to allow them, you know, some time for venting or some time to express that anger? You know, saying something like, you know, I can see that you're really pissed off. I can see that you're really angry, frustrated about your situation. Let's spend a few minutes talking about that. And then let's look at how I might be able to help you. Sometimes that can be having, again, that unstructured time for people just to express how they're feeling, and then focusing on working on some solutions can be really helpful. I guess the caveat or the danger of that approach is that sometimes that can get people even more amped up. So that's something that you want to pay attention to in terms of body language and how people are responding to that invitation. So again, right, being adaptive to a situation and looking at how that person is reacting. You know, if you're finding that, you know, the anger is escalating, or there's an, you know, abusive behavior going on, I think it's really important to, you know, be clear with the person that there are boundaries, that respect is an expectation, and that there's a consequence. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend using that word, but saying, if you're finding it really challenging to focus right now, or if you're, I see that you're really struggling, why don't you take a break? Go outside, have a smoke, take a walk. Let's come back in 10 minutes, come back tomorrow, come back at another time. Or, perhaps you're talking to somebody on the phone and you're just finding that you can't penetrate. They're so angry in the moment. It can be useful to just kind of redirect them and let them know that you're not dismissing their concerns. You're not unwilling to help them, but in the moment that it's not constructive. And that you can come back to it, whether that's, again, in a short period of time, or if it's better to reschedule and have them come back at another time. I see that Noelle has said the words, "I believe you," when someone is accustomed to being challenged about their story, has diffused a lot of anger from being directed at me. I think that's really important. And thank you for sharing that. So reassuring, it's kind of the last point, reassuring someone that their concerns are important and that you want to hear them and that this is a safe space to talk about them, I think is really important. I think people often expect, especially people who are struggling with, mental health or who have a lot of engagement with different systems, often expect to be either disbelieved or dismissed when they have concerns, or they actually have been, though that's been their experience. And so validating, saying, I believe you, or, again, empathizing with the particular situation they're in and asking them how you can be helpful, I think can be quite disarming. And I think people, I think we know that oftentimes expressing anger in certain environments and workplaces results in people being either banned or the police being called, or, some kind of, fairly dramatic intervention. And so if we can use our skills to kind of de-escalate a situation and let somebody know that we will continue to work with them, even though they're angry, I think that can be a really good relationship builder. So thank you for that, Noelle. And again, invite people if they have any other strategies. So yeah, like having that balance between allowing somebody to be angry and at the same time reminding them that you're here to work together and you are there to support them. And also that, there's a need for cooperation and respect. I see that there's a question. I have many calls in which people are very angry because we've had to refer them out and they find themselves calling different organizations and they're not able to get direct representation. Unfortunately, there's few organizations that deal with judicial review and most of the clinics are full. How do you deal with, so you're not going to help me, you do not care? Oh yeah, again, right? Like I think not taking that personally is really important. I think it's hard not to. That people recognizing that people are expressing frustration with poor systems and inadequate systems. I think one thing that I've found helpful, and you can't control what other organizations do or how you get clients referred to you, but one of the things that I always did was when I was referring someone, I always made sure I did my homework before I did that. So if I was unable to help somebody, say it was an issue that was beyond my scope or judicial review, I would let someone know that this is what, like going back to your own rules and policies. So making it not personal, but about, okay, our organization, our services are limited. We can help you up to this point. And that's a decision I don't have control over. And then when you're making a referral for somebody, making sure that, you've done your homework so that, you know what kind of cases that other organization takes on, what their referral process looks like, and even maybe what their wait list or their timeframes look like. So if we can do some of the research up front so that the person's not encountering a service that isn't going to be useful, or knows and expects that they're going to have to wait for a period of time before they can get service. Sometimes that's really helpful. And again, I think, you are going to hear that. So you're not going to help me, or you don't care. And I think it's important to, again, recognize that that's not necessarily a personal comment, and that sometimes just letting people know that what you can help with and what you can help with, and that's something that's beyond your control and your scope to be able to assist with. It's just, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the resources to be able to help, and letting them know that you do care and that you want to help them to the best of your ability, find the resources that can help them. And that, again, empathizing with how frustrating it is to be out there looking for help and not necessarily be able to obtain it. You're welcome. So in terms of some other tips about working with people who are angry, I think our body language is really important. Making sure that, again, you're aware of your own physical safety and space. So giving that person, a lot of space in the room, if you can, to, so that you're not necessarily in a space where you can be directly confronted. Keeping your arms open, keeping kind of like an open body language, avoiding things like crossing your arms, having a good firm stance and keeping your arms down so that you're not coming across as being aggressive, I think can be really helpful. And being aware of your own tone of voice or language. It's easy for some of us to be provoked when someone is angry with us, be defensive, try and rationalize why we're trying to help or how we're trying to help. And I think, as much as we can, remaining calm but firm, breathing through any kind of emotional response that we're having, really trying to speak moderately, not necessarily matching the tone of voice with somebody else's escalated tone of voice can be really helpful just in bringing the energy down. The other thing I found can be helpful is just using somebody's name. So trying to, again, connect with somebody on a really human and personal level and letting them know that they're recognized as an individual. So I would often use somebody's name frequently, and sometimes it helps them to just draw them back to the immediate situation that they're in, and using positive language. So, sometimes I think it's easy for us to say things like, you should have told me that, or, you said you were going to follow up on this and you didn't. And that, again, that can really escalate a situation rather than de-escalate it. So looking at like the language of cooperation. So, let's look at the options that we have right now. How can we figure this out together? We might not necessarily agree, but let's figure out how we can move forward. And, as Noelle was saying, just really reassuring that person that they're being heard, and that whatever concerns that they have are really important, can be, again, something that helps people refocus back on trying to work through the issue. Any other comments or tips that people have? I just invite you to put those in the chat if you have any other tips. Okay, so talking about high conflict individuals, I worked with a lot of folks who are in conflict in many areas of their life. And what I found was that there were often people with unresolved or untreated trauma. And we talked about some of the ways in which trauma expresses itself for folks. And that, is often rigid thinking, not being able to self-reflect, blaming others, being angry, demanding special treatment, even manipulating staff to try and get their way. And it's not necessarily because people are bad people, but because they just don't have the skills necessarily to navigate the world and navigate the various personal and other types of relationships that they're in. One of the things I one of the organizations I found really useful in terms of helping me work more effectively with people with a lot of conflict in their life is the High Conflict Institute, which some people may have heard of. So I believe it was started by a lawyer and mediator who's still actively practicing, named Bill Eddy. And they do a lot of, he's published some books, and they do have some really good tip sheets and resources that they've developed on working with people who are high conflict. And I found their work to be really helpful. So I would suggest checking out that website. They've got some good tip sheets. So, you know, a couple of the tips that I learned from this organization and from their work were things like, you know, it's really important when you're working with high conflict folks to remember that it's not personal to you, that these people are often in multiple conflicts in their life. And likelihood is that at some point in the relationship, you're also going to be in conflict with them. That that kind of drama is probably inevitable, that they're going to be displeased or unhappy with some aspect of your service. So to kind of expect it, keep an arm's length relationship, and recognize that it really has nothing to do with you personally, but is more about what's going on for them in their own brains and how they're processing information and emotions. The other thing that it was important for me to recognize was that it was very natural for me to be frustrated and feel burnt out, and sometimes even want to abandon working with somebody who was very emotionally dysregulated and had sort of cognitive distortions about even our relationship. So my willingness to help or my ability to help. So that my feelings of being frustrated were very normal and natural in this situation. And to just, again, breathe through it, take care of myself, use my colleagues for support and consistency, and recognize that it was okay to not always be 100% generous. But again, not to bring that necessarily into the relationship. Recognizing that I wasn't responsible for outcomes and really giving it back to the person to make those decisions, especially when they're resistant, giving it back to them by saying, you know, it's up to you what you decide. My role here is to give you some options, to talk things through with you, and that my responsibility is to be professional and compassionate, but that my responsibility is not to make choices for people, but to give it back to them, which again can be really helpful in terms of, just setting boundaries around what your role is. And also, when you have to draw somebody back when they're kind of, perseverating or obsessing about certain things, that you can draw them back to decisions that they've made. So one of the things Bill Eddy says is that, everybody gets upset some of the time, which is true, but that high conflict people get upset a lot of the time. So expect the drama to happen if you've identified somebody who's in conflict with a lot of areas in their life. And one of the things that I found really helpful was using this model that they have. And thank you, Jen, for your comments on working with someone who's angry, giving people time to reconnect later when they're ready. I think that's really, really important, that sometimes being able to identify when someone's just on overload, or they're just completely saturated with that emotion, that it's better to just take that space for everybody's safety. So thank you for saying that. So in terms of high conflict folks, I found this model to be really helpful. And again, you can find some tip sheets that are really useful on their website. So they recommend that you use what they call ear statements. So they're short statements that acknowledge someone's emotions. You're making that attempt to connect with them in the moment and help them calm down. But you're keeping them focused on problem solving. And They can really help you connect with somebody and calm them down when they're really escalated. So the first step in that is, again, just acknowledging someone's emotions. So I can hear how upset you are. I can see how frustrated you are. Tell me what's going on. Tell me how I can be helpful to you. And then acknowledging that and respecting that person's efforts. So again, it's connecting with somebody on a personal level, helping bring down the emotional kind of distress that's happening in the situation, and acknowledging that you see someone. I found this to be a really simple and effective way of just really helping people focus, helping people feel heard, and also, letting people know that I care and that I'm actually here to help. And it seems like a fairly simple method, but I think it's actually I found it to be quite helpful. And they suggest that when you're in a challenging situation with someone who is, is very high conflict and is looking for drama and, kind of sees the whole world as against them, that it's often very helpful to respond with, these ear statements. So again, empathy, attention, and respect, sometimes over and over and over again, like bringing people back to this, helping them to focus on what the options are available and bringing it back to that person's agency to make decisions. So again, it's up to you what you decide, not having a personal opinion or interest in particular about what it is that they choose to do. So reminding them of their own agency in making decisions on a particular matter. And they talk about BIF responses. So keeping things brief. So not being overly wordy, not being overly explanatory, just being really brief and clear in terms of how you explain things, being firm, being friendly and fair, and then setting limits. So not making things personal. And again, using things like policies, regulations, rules, procedures, to set those limits, like we were talking about when I think it was Anna raised the question around, people feeling like you don't care about them if you're not able to provide a specific service. So really, it's not about that. It's not about a personal decision to not help or not care. It's about we have these policies in place, we have these rules in place, or this request is outside of the scope of my job, or I'm not a counselor, or we don't provide that specific kind of advocacy, or the legislation doesn't provide for the option that you're requesting. That particular outcome is not possible. So let's look at what might be possible and how we can help you get what you need. These are really, really tough situations in my experience because, one, they're really taxing in terms of one's sort of elastic band of emotional, breadth and bandwidth. But again, setting those limits and really just helping people to feel like they're heard, I think can be really helpful. Sorry, I see Andre has made a comment about sometimes clients misdirect anger at a situation to anger at a person. If it's safe to do so, it often helps them to see this difference. I think that's really true. I think oftentimes people are not angry at us per se. They're angry at either somebody else or the particular situation that they find themselves in. And maybe we've created enough safety in our relationship with them that they feel comfortable to be able to express that anger. Maybe, Andre, can you talk about how you help people see that difference? Is there something that you say to distinguish that anger, that general anger versus anger at a person? Not to put you on the spot.
It might be that she doesn't have the mic capacity.
Okay. Yeah, if you wanted to put anything in the chat about how you do that, that would be great. But I think, yeah, being able to distinguish for ourselves, one, that the anger again is not personal, but also helping that person understand. Oh, interesting, Jenna. So what would you do when a client really is misdirecting anger and cannot be reasoned with? I had a client this week that started making accusations about my personal life and said that they had looked me up online. Oh, it's the new world that we're living in, isn't it? Where so much information, personal information about ourselves is accessible to people, and people can find out things about us that we don't necessarily want them to find out. Well, I would say a couple of things. One is, trying to reason with someone when they're angry, I think is really challenging, right? Because I don't necessarily know physiologically what's going on in the brain, but I think that the capacity, as we often know when we're feeling really, really emotional about something, our capacity to logically process or rationally process it is compromised. So I don't know that it's always a good strategy to try and reason with someone. I think in that circumstance, it might be important to just be really clear about the boundary and not entertain the conversation. And by that, I mean being very firm with the client and saying, I'm not willing to have any conversations with you about my personal life. And redirecting them back to how can I help you in this moment. I think, you could it would probably be quite tempting, and I would certainly understand wanting to defend yourself or say that's not appropriate to be looking me up online, but probably in that moment, they're not going to actually be able to hear that. So just being, really clear that you're not willing to have that conversation, and asking how you can help them with whatever their issue is in that moment. And again, I think if they're not able to be kind of distracted from whatever tangent that they're going on, that maybe it's best in that circumstance to say, I think it's better if we talk at another time. Why don't you call me back? Or let's set a time, or call me back at this particular time when we can talk about what it is that you want to talk about. Yeah, exactly, right? They were trying to intimidate me since they were upset. And absolutely that feeling, and I'm sure they're, strategically it's a good way to provoke someone, right? Because we feel that's our boundaries have been violated and our personal life has been intruded upon. So it would have been very easy for you to go, whoa. But I think just not engaging in that circumstance is probably the best option, and redirecting as best as you can. Okay. Yeah. Uncomfortable silence. Sometimes just a non-reaction. Right? I think it depends on what the boundary is. Obviously, if someone's really transgressed something that's important to you, like asking you personal questions, or maybe asking you out on a date, or, making a sexual comment of some kind, sometimes it's best to be really clear that that's not cool, and that you're not going to discuss your personal life. But sometimes, yeah, just silence, and a person will often transition into a different conversation or take the conversation in a different way, in a different direction, because you're not responsive. Like sometimes people want a reaction more than anything. So another good strategy. Thanks, Noelle. Again, check out the high conflict folks. They have some really good stuff. But in some of the things that I've used in terms of when I'm working with really high conflict people is having a lot of structure in place. So really setting out the nature and length of meetings that I'm going to have with someone. So we have an hour. Let's work on what we want to accomplish, and being really firm about sticking to those structures that I put in place. So if, again, we were talking earlier about people who call and want a lot of emotional support, being very clear that, I have 15 minutes on Wednesdays at this time. Please call me. I'm happy to talk to you at that time. But once that time is up, giving people, a 1-minute warning and saying, okay, I have to go and I'll talk to you again next week. So having a lot of structure in place around, how much time you spend with someone, what you're going to try and accomplish, and also letting them know about things like delays or when you're going to return phone calls. So if you have a really big caseload and you can't return phone calls, within a couple of days, letting them know that, so they know what to expect and they don't feel like you're abandoning them. That's often a trigger for people to escalate their behaviors when they feel like they're not being heard or they're not being listened to or they're being abandoned. So just being really clear at the outset about, what you can offer and what you can help with and what that structure looks like. Lots of repetition. So again, those ear statements, talking about options, and trying to do that without getting frustrated, which can be very, very challenging. But again, people sometimes really need to hear the same things over and over again. Things like documenting next steps, which we've talked about as a strategy for different, working with different folks who are in challenging situations. So when you were, creating, lists or agreements around what you've agreed to do, what they've agreed to do, and reporting back on your work. So that can help clarify or articulate your commitments to doing this work together, and that you're committed to, as much as you can, seeing the particular issue to resolution. But it also helps someone else to create some responsibility for their own decisions and behaviors. So you're giving decisions back to them. So if they're agreeing to do specific things and they haven't followed up on that, and then they want to create this big conflict around nothing getting done, you can bring them back to that list of things that they were going to do, not in a judgmental way, but just in, well, these things need to get done if we're going to move forward with this. Sorry. Thank you, Andre, for making that comment. And I would invite everyone to read that, bringing people back to, get people seeing that the decision is not personal, but really about these structures and rules that we all have to follow and are in place. So using your skills, so lots of active listening, being firm, using empathy when you can, and trying to focus on goals and problem solving rather than emotions. Again, I think there's a space for letting people, and it's a very delicate balance, letting people express some emotion, express some anger, express some frustration. But again, that's not the primary role that we're there to fulfill. It's really focusing on prioritizing what the goals and objectives are. Self-care, being able to tolerate frustration, hostility, anger without retaliating or withdrawing, which is a skill that it took me a really long time to learn, especially around the withdrawing part. So understanding that hostility is part of the territory, and that, again, it's not personal, and that being firm and friendly, even in the face of that hostility, can be really important. Setting boundaries, being consistent, articulating time limitations, and responding to complaints. So having a good complaint process within your organization and making sure that you're familiar with it. So if somebody does have a complaint about the service you've provided, they have a place that they can go. And again, it's not personal. There's a structure and a process in place that they can access. Okay. So I see Andre's also added, if they're angry at me, I acknowledge that and let them know that I'm willing to work with them if they're willing to put that anger aside for now and work with me. Again, I love that. Just using that language of one acknowledgement. I see this, I see you're angry. Sometimes people just want to be heard and validated. And again, as a follow-up to that, you have my attention and I want to work with you. I want to help you to solve this issue that's going on. oftentimes, again, when people are angry, they're banned or they're told to leave an office or, or more severe consequences. So being reassured that you care about their concerns can be a really good way of disarming people. Okay. So one of the issues that was also identified is working with clients who might lack capacity. And again, I want to draw, this is a several-hour workshop on its own. And I see we're quickly running out of time. So I want to just invite people to check out some resources. And I'm happy to, thanks Joshua, be well. I'm happy to send some links to Lois or to Sarah for some of the documents that I think people who are really interested in this particular topic should have a closer look at. So Seniors First does a lot of work with elders and seniors. And they have produced some really good documents for advocates who are legal advocates and lawyers who are working with folks who might be in a situation where they lack capacity, that can be really helpful in terms of guiding decision-making around when you may need to investigate or delve into that situation in more depth. Also, the public guardian and trustee has some good materials on this particular issue, as does the Center for Elder Law. And they, again, do a lot of education and training and resource development on working with elders. And often it is oftentimes seniors and elders who are raising those questions for us, whether or not they have the capacity to make decisions. And again, good point, Noelle, acknowledging that anger is often very, very justified in a situation, and that really our responsibility is to manage our own emotional response and maintain our own awareness and calm. So in terms of working with clients, just some general points that I thought were important to raise is capacity is really about that ability to understand information that's relevant to the decision that's being made, and the ability to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences of a decision or a lack of decision. And capacity is very variable depending on the person and depending on the circumstances. So it's going to vary, especially if you're looking at working with folks who have dementia or Alzheimer's, or say they have a mental health issue. It's going to be variable depending on the nature of their illness, their symptoms, fatigue even. It's going to look different over time, and capacity may be, or incapacity might be a temporary situation. There is no single global test of capacity. It's variable depending on legislation and depending on common law. So someone's capacity, for example, to write a will and agree to a will looks different than it does for someone who's perhaps deciding they want to get married. So those tests of capacity are going to look quite differently. And as I said, one of the things that folks who are real experts in this area talk about is the capacity continuum. It's not an either or thing, and it can be quite variable. And there's a presumption in law that adults have the ability to make unwise or risky decisions if they have that ability to understand the information and the ability to appreciate those consequences. And the presence of a mental health impairment is certainly not enough on its own to draw a conclusion of incapacity. So there's a couple of further points about capacity and some links to a resource. And the other thing I wanted to say, gosh, time has gone so fast, is one of the things that, is often recommended is that your approach to, you're probably going to be in a situation at one point or another where you're having to make that initial assessment of capacity, like, does this person really understand the information that I'm trying to provide in this circumstance? And can they actually understand what the consequences might be? And again, Seniors First has some really good resources on making those initial assessments. So looking at things like cognitive functioning. So how does the person are they able to parrot back or tell you what it is that the advice or information that you've given them? Do they seem to forget things within the first 15 or 20 minutes of having a conversation? Are they making bizarre statements? Are they suffering from hallucinations or delusions? So this resource gives you some prompts about all these different areas that you can look at in terms of whether it seems like someone has the capacity to understand consequences, and what to do in the event that if you're in a situation where you feel like someone doesn't have capacity. So if you're in a situation where you're making that initial assessment and you've decided, I really have moderate to severe concerns about somebody's capacity, really at that stage, there's, the first step is really going to be getting that person a medical or a mental health capacity assessment, and having a physician or someone who's a professional in that circumstance make it, do an assessment and draw a conclusion about that person's capacity. And then there may be a next stage where a substitute decision maker needs to be put in place. But those are going to be rare kinds of circumstances, and it's not an easy process. Oftentimes with things like capacity issues, it's often using mitigation strategies. So again, a lot of the things that we've talked about. So somebody might not be presenting very well in a particular situation or circumstance, and it may be due to any number of things that really have nothing to do with their inherent capacity. It could be things like, they're really anxious and they've had, insomnia for the last 7 days, or they're on a particular medication that's having impacts on their cognitive ability, or they're off their medication and they are their hallucinations or their delusions are really, really pronounced. So it may be looking at, again, mitigation strategies. So delaying something, or making sure that they have something to eat or have had a good night's rest before moving forward with planning or making any decisions around a specific decision that they want to make. So this is a really big topic, and there are a lot of really specific elements to assessing capacity, and some really, really helpful resources that, again, I'm happy to send to the Law Foundation, and they can pass those on to you via email.
Great, thanks.
Does anyone have anything else that they want to add to that? Anyone who has a particular interest or expertise in this area? Wouldn't this create barriers on trust? Yeah, I mean, I think really that's the first step with anyone, again, and one of the things that I think is widely recommended in these circumstances would be, as much as you can, using those mitigation strategies, right? So being clear with somebody that you're concerned about their ability to make a decision, and looking at the specific circumstances of, why do you feel that way? And figuring out whether or not there are those mitigation strategies that you can use. So is it just that somebody's super anxious? Is it that somebody's, just had a really difficult experience and it's causing them to not be themselves? Is it that they haven't eaten or slept? So really looking at the lowest intervention possible, and then having a conversation with somebody If you're really, really concerned that maybe they're in harm's way, or that really you can't do anything for them because they're not able to make decisions for themselves, having a conversation about a possible medical referral or mental health referral, and trying as much as possible to get them engaged, and maybe even being the person that makes that phone call. Okay, I see we have like about 5 more minutes. I'm wondering if folks should have we'll have the PowerPoint. So the things I wasn't able to cover, certainly there's some information in there, and people can, feel free to contact me if you have specific questions that I wasn't able to answer, but wanted to see if there's any sort of last minute questions or thoughts that people wanted to share before we wrap up. So Lois and Sarah, if I have some resources that I think might be helpful, could I send that to you, and then you could get that off to folks?
Yeah, we'll probably post it on Shed and let people know that there's more material up there.
Okay, I will definitely put those together.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It was a really a useful session on so many levels, I think. It was nice that people had an opportunity to ask you questions and engage. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate all of your questions and all of your own strategies that you shared. One of the things that I learned so much from is from people like you who are doing this work. And thank you for giving me more ideas. So be well and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.